Hi, everybody. Is this microphone working? How are you? I really appreciate everybody being here tonight. Thank you. I have to give special thanks and props to my friend Ken Owen, who was instrumental in bringing me here. You guys are really lucky to have Ken as your executive director of media relations at DePauw. Ken is the James Brown of higher ed PR. Hardest working guy in our field and also the most fun to be around. I also want to give thanks to PT and special hello to President Casey, who I've had the opportunity to meet a couple of times. Yeah, I feel really honored to be here and to be the Mendenhall speaker. When I looked at the list of other people who have done this, I felt grateful and humble and unqualified, especially Marcus Borg and Karen Armstrong, who are two of the writers who have influenced me the most. And to be on the same list as them and to be having my book out here is a little bit overwhelming. And giving a speech is also a little bit overwhelming, but I'll look forward to the question and answer part of this that will follow the 40 minutes or so of presentation that I have. So here's our agenda for tonight. We're going to watch some video clips from the sports world and unpack them a little bit. I'm going to read some passages from my brand new book, Onward Christian Athletes. And I'm going to talk a bit about what I have found in my research on evangelical Christianity in pro sports. I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and perspectives and opinions. I really want to have a conversation at the end of this. So don't be shy and feel free to ask me anything and even challenge me if you think I said something that's off, because I'm all about having the conversation. Now let me set the scene a little bit. As you heard, I do opinion writing about religion in public life, mainly for USA Today and its On Religion page that appears on Mondays. As a writer and a citizen, I'm keenly interested in the way that religion plays out in our public square and culture. Now, big-time sports is one area of our culture where religion manifests in ways that are conspicuous and fascinating, in ways that evoke larger truths and trends. Yet this aspect of religion in our culture has not, in my opinion, received the attention and the critical examination that it deserves. My book is my attempt to begin filling that gap. In the book and in my talk tonight, I try to capture how faith shows up in our big-time spectator sports. What's behind it, what's good and logical about it, and frankly, what's problematic about it from my perspective as one who values religious diversity, which we have in America, and in view of the public mission and responsibility of pro sports and our leagues and teams. We'll mainly be looking at pro sports, the NFL, the NBA, and Major League Baseball. A few examples and stories from the college ranks. I want to point out that my research does not cover women's sports. That's a decision I made early on in my research, mainly because I needed a manageable size and scope for the project, and because the issues that are most salient to me are particularly acute around those big three men's sports in those leagues. Now, there may be some who are here tonight who are not sports fans, and they're wondering if this is really the talk for them. And so I thank you for coming despite your qualms. And I invite you to hang in here with me. One reason that this issue of Christianity in sports has fascinated me is that I think it's a microcosm of the larger issues that we see around the place of religion in our society. It brings up the same big questions and big conflicts about the role of religion in American public life and politics. And especially about how we accommodate what I call one-truth Christianity in a diverse, pluralistic society. So let me introduce the big ideas that came out of my study of Christianity in sports. Point one, the religiosity that we see reflects an intentional effort by evangelical ministries and interests to use sports as a platform to promote Christianity. Now, I suspect a lot of you are familiar with groups like Athletes in Action, Fellowship of Christian Athletes. Some of you may be members even, or were members in the past. These organizations and others like them have been hard at work for over half a century to leverage the popularity and influence of sports to reach the broad public with their evangelistic message. Now, point two, a big part of the agenda of these ministries and of this Christian movement is to provide athletes with religious counseling and moral guidance. And for that, I give them great credit. That makes a lot of sense to me. There's another more controversial side to it as well. In many cases, Christianity in sports has aligned strongly with Christian right ideology and organizations. And I believe this is something that is at counter purposes with the interests of the majority of us in the diverse communities that support these pro teams. Point three, I think there's been a lack of critical thinking about what's going on here, and not just on the part of the promoters of Christianity in sports, but on the part of the many non-evangelical and non-believing fans who criticize religious athletes and religion in sports without any real depth or understanding or fairness, frankly. So beyond sheer annoyance and cynicism about Christian athletes, and I do see and hear a lot of that, what legitimate case can be articulated by the non-evangelical majority about and possibly against the current shape of faith in the game? And then finally, we'll look at some changes that I see emerging on the faith in sports landscape that point the way toward a more constructive and unifying engagement between religion and sports. To cop the language of one of the change agents I've gotten to know, what would it mean if sports ministry broadened its mission such that it attempted to do more than use sports as a platform for evangelism, if it attempted to address what we might call the sins of big-time sports in America? Now let me show you a clip. It's the scene that I use in the very opening of my book. We're going to see Kurt Warner of the Arizona Cardinals do a quick interview on live national TV after his team has just won the National Conference Championship. I don't have the volume control. Here's what I say in the book about this. "You knew I was going to do it," the jubilant quarterback said with a shrug and a quick look at his network TV interviewer, "but I got to do it." And yes, he was right. Whatever we thought of the good or the bad of the deed that Kurt Warner had to perform, none of us who knew anything about the freshly crowned football champion could claim surprise. Like Fox television host Terry Bradshaw, like many of the 70,000 fans inside that stadium, like many of the tens of millions watching on television, lots of us did know that the Super Bowl-bound quarterback was going to use his moment on the victory platform in the live TV spotlight to champion the cause dearest to his heart. From the moment he threw the game-winning touchdown pass to complete his reascension to the top of the pro football world, we in fandom knew with eye-rolling dread some of us, or with proud anticipation, that Warner, leader of the newly minted NFC champion Arizona Cardinals, was going to proclaim his devotion to Jesus. We knew because Warner, like so many of his professional athlete brothers today, can't seem to let his moments of high-profile good fortune go by without bringing his Christian religion into it and without making sure that God becomes part of it for us spectators too. The concept of using sports to advertise services and products goes a long way toward explaining Kurt Warner's seemingly forced thanks to Jesus pitch in the post-game interview. And a multitude of similar Christian displays furnished game after game, year after year, by the contestants in America's big-time sports. For advertising Jesus and the religion that revolves around him well describes the nature of Warner's gambit in his moment of championship glory. Unpack Warner's proclamation, and one begins to understand the dynamics of a Christianity in sports movement that, for all its highly visible manifestations, has a little seen and less well understood history, logic, infrastructure, subplot, and set of implications. More than most evangelizing athletes, Kurt Warner tipped his hand in his January 2009 post-game proclamation, revealing the not exactly spontaneous nature of players' shout-outs to the Lord. "I gotta do it," Warner admitted. "Such is the religious duty and opportunity that pro-athlete Christians are taught to accept and fulfill by a network of evangelical chaplains and ministry organizations that have long appreciated the advertising value of big-time sports." Warner telegraphed something else that's important to know about evangelical Christianity in the game: the ever-present pushback. "Everybody is going to be tired of hearing this," Warner admitted, as if to give all of the non-religious spectators the chance to brace themselves or hit the mute button. And Warner is certainly right. Many, many people do grow weary of hearing multi-millionaire athletes proclaiming their Christian faith in ways and in moments that sometimes seem to trivialize religion's rich complexity as powerfully as they offend and divide portions of the viewing audience. Yes, we did know that Kurt Warner was going to turn his victorious moment into a plug for his evangelical faith, because we're accustomed to hearing victorious players wax religious in a day and age when sports are not only hugely popular, but often drenched with Christian religion. But what we don't know or understand well is the how and the why and the what does it all mean. Lots of us in the non-evangelical majority might roll our eyes when players wear their faith on their sleeve, but we have failed to articulate a compelling case about sports world religion in its present form, or even establish the fact that we, the public, have a right to make that case. Nor have we done enough to concede aspects of Christianity in sports that are inevitable, understandable, legitimate, positive, and constructive in exerting moral influence on a sector that, with all its gaudy excesses, could really use some positive moral force. In short of banning religion in sports, a non-starter in a culture that values religious freedom, we have failed to shape a vision for a more appropriate, fair, and thoughtful form of faith in the game. So when you see the book, you'll notice that, I say when and not if, that's kind of cocky, but if you see the book, you'll see that there's a lot of politics in it, and that's a big part of the equation. The politics that you'll often see just below the surface where faith and sports intersect. My first chapter opens with a fascinating scene that played out in January 2006 in Philadelphia and on TVs across the country, something that brought together religion and sports and politics in a revealing way. It was an event called Justice Sunday 3, featuring a minister and former pro football player by the name of Herbert Lusk. Lusk is a central figure in the lore of Christianity in sports, by virtue of his being the first player in NFL history to kneel down and pray in the end zone following a touchdown. That moment came in 1977 in a game between the New York Football Giants and Lusk's Philadelphia Eagles. Today, Lusk is known for far more than being the father of the end zone prayer. He is the pastor of Greater Exodus Baptist Church in Philadelphia, and through the first part of this decade, he gained a higher and higher profile in Christian conservative politics. It was in his political capacity that he hosted Justice Sunday 3, which took place during the height of Christian right visibility and power. This event was featured the leading figures in the Christian right movement. As you'll see in this upcoming video segment, up on that pulpit with Herb Lusk was kind of an all-star lineup of Christian conservative figures. Moral Majority founder Jerry Falwell, James Dobson, founder of Focus on the Family, Tony Perkins, head of the Family Research Council. Also part of the event was Alveda King, who is the niece of Martin Luther King Jr. and someone who is an outspoken anti-abortion activist. So the purpose of this Justice Sunday 3 was to rally the troops in support for the confirmation of Samuel Alito, who had been nominated to the Supreme Court and whose confirmation was pending. As you know, Alito did get confirmed and now sits on the court. So let's take a look at this video and then talk about what it might mean.
AT&T Postgame Show. Welcome to Justice Sunday 3. Proclaim liberty is on the bell. A special presentation by the Family Research Council and Focus on the Family Action from Greater Exodus Baptist Church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Please welcome the senior pastor of Greater Exodus Baptist Church, Reverend Herbert Lusk.
I tell you, my friends, hosting this a great event this year has been quite interesting. I've been called everything but a child of God. I've been called a sellout. I've been called an Uncle Tom. And the New York Times called me a maverick to the black church. Well, my friends, I just want the Times to know that if a maverick can be defined as one who is pro-life, then I'm a maverick. But the foundation is being tampered with. We're facing in history like we have never before this hostility against the people of God. And my brothers and my sisters, I want you to know that I will not go down lightly. Just bring one thing out there, my seat. I want to say, first of all, be careful how you fool with church. You think about a whole lot, but when you start messing with the church, something stirred up inside of me. Be careful because the church has surviving power. My friends, you know this and know this well. Don't fool with the church because the church has buried a many critics. And all the critics that we have not buried will make a funeral interest for.
Here's what I say about it in the book. Lusk's rallying of the troops at Greater Exodus that winter night in Philadelphia captured a moment in time and showcased a long-developing relationship that had come into full bloom in the early years of the new century. The players in this powerful triumvirate, evangelicals, political conservatives, and perhaps surprising at first glance, the world of professional sports. How fitting that a pro footballer turned minister, the very father of the end zone prayer, played this crucial role in an event stunning for its melding of white conservatives and black Christians, and for its linking of race, religion, politics, culture, and sports. Because if one were to choose a human symbol of the complex dynamics that have turned pro sports into a vehicle for the promotion of Christianity, and the conservative political worldview right alongside it, no person would serve quite like Herbert Lusk. Why Lusk? There is his religious piety. In an age when religious gestures on the field are both conspicuous and commonplace, Lusk is the one who started it all with that fateful display in the Giants' end zone. His act of kneeling was contagious, and barely a pro football or baseball game passes today without Christian players praying at the mound or home plate, pointing triumphantly to the heavens after a touchdown, or praising their God in post-game interviews. These displays are emblematic of something deeper in sports, an engagement by evangelical Christians that has progressed to the point where born-again believers make up something approaching 40% of the rosters of many teams in professional baseball, football, and basketball. There's the nature of Lusk's faith. Lusk is an evangelical, an adherent to and promoter of the conservative branch of Christian belief that dominates religious practice in our major professional sports leagues. On that given Sunday in Philadelphia, pro sports, evangelical religion, and conservative politics came together in a stark framing of a powerful current in American life. Yet on any given Sunday, in the NFL or pro basketball or Major League Baseball, the same dynamics are there together too. Depending on one's leanings, all of this might be worthy of cheers, not concerns. After all, in a sports culture plagued by immorality and self-seeking, what could be wrong with some good old religion and traditional values, with a perspective larger than oneself? Let it be said that the Herb Lusks of the sports, culture, politics realm, all the current and ex-athletes who carry the banner for Christ, do considerable good in their congregations and communities. They often demonstrate outstanding personal morality, and they have every right to hold and promote their beliefs in a country that cherishes religious freedom. But whatever one's opinion about the rights and wrongs of Christianity in sports, it is well worth understanding that the pious proclamations on our fields are more than isolated, spontaneous occurrences. In potent and well-organized combination, pro sports and Christianity have been coming together in the nation's stadiums as part of a concerted campaign for Jesus, and often with it, a sustained drive to shape America in the mold of the leaders who joined together at Greater Exodus on a Sunday night in Philadelphia. Tony Perkins, James Dobson, Jerry Falwell, and the Reverend Herbert Lusk. So it's very clear that Reverend Lusk started something with that display in the Giants' end zone back in the 70s. So if you watch pro sports these days, you see his legacy. You see it in the on-field religious displays of players during triumphant moments, and in the statements they make during moments of victory. So let's take a look at some of these scenes and see what I'm talking about. I want to start with something that comes from last spring and the NBA playoffs. We're going to hear Dwight Howard of the Orlando Magic being interviewed following his team's victory over Boston in Game 7 of that series.
So we dreamed that you guys were going to win this game, and you didn't hit the three to win it, but you'll take this as a snap.
First, I want to thank God, man. Without him, none of this would be possible. I told my guys before the game, we come out, we play 100% play all 48 minutes, God will do the rest. And he did tonight. We got a good victory, man. It's all because of him.
Where you were at?
A quick note about Dwight Howard. He caused a sensation about 5 years ago when he entered the NBA as a rookie. And he stated to ESPN and other media outlets that his goal would be that by the time his career ended, that the cross would be emblazoned on the NBA logo, right with that silhouette of Jerry West. Now we're going to look at last fall's World Series. Brad Lidge of the Phillies has just gotten the final out to complete the series clinching victory for Philadelphia. And now we're going to go back a few years to the NBA Finals. Detroit's Chauncey Billups is collecting his series MVP trophy and making a few comments. And here's an inside look at what often happens in locker rooms following games. We're going to see the Los Angeles Lakers circle up and say the Lord's Prayer. We'll get to that one later. As you see, because of athletes' willingness and eagerness to speak out about their faith, God often becomes part of the dramatic moments when games and championships are won. Now, for most of the sports audience, this is the piece of religion and sports that we see, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. Let's look beneath the surface of the water a little bit and consider the ideas and motivation of athletes who speak up about their faith. This quote from former Major League ballplayer Morgan Ensberg: "The entire reason I play baseball is so that I get a chance to speak about Christ." The same idea was expressed in very bold fashion by then Indiana University coach Mike Davis earlier this decade. This was after the Hoosiers made a surprising run in the NCAA tournament, including an upset win over Duke. So you see the quote from Coach Davis. "On senior night, I told the people we were going to advance to the championship game, and we did. That was God's voice saying, 'Give me the credit and I'll bring you through.' There was no way on paper that Indiana should have beat Duke in Oklahoma and play for the national championship. But I knew we would be there. I knew God put me on the platform to share His word." For a little more insight on the strategy of ministries like the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, consider this statement from an FCA staffer who I interviewed. This comes from a few years ago when Mike Sweeney was still with the Kansas City Royals. This staff member told me that he really sees his work as an enterprise in target marketing. He says that if I walked into a restaurant to share my faith in Jesus, maybe 2 or 3 people would turn their heads, and maybe a couple would throw a tomato at me. Most people would say, "Yeah, whatever." If Mike Sweeney were to walk into a restaurant and do the same, every head in the place would turn. 90% of the people there would know who he is. Mike Sweeney could share his relationship with Christ and have an impact. People will listen just because he's able to hit a fastball 400 feet. That's the concept of influence. Rather than bemoaning the fact, let's accept that Mike has something to share and equip him to share it. So as this would suggest, there's often a faith coach of sorts behind the evangelizing players that we see on TV. Not that what these guys are saying isn't sincere and spontaneous in many cases, but there often is somebody behind the scenes from a ministry organization who is encouraging players to use their platform to share their faith and influence the public. Now, when I talk with people about my research, I find that they are often surprised when I tell them that every team in the NBA, NFL, and Major League Baseball has a Christian chaplain embedded with it. Now, part of the purpose of these chaplains is to provide religious support and counseling to players, and that does make a lot of sense to me. Given the logistical problems that an athlete has in getting to church on Sunday, for example, given the unique pressures that athletes face, I can understand why many would want to access religious resources. There's another less understood part of the job description of these chaplains, though. Most of them come from evangelical ministries and perspectives, and they are there to promote the evangelical message to and through the athletes who command so much attention in sports-obsessed America. Now, some may say, well, what's the problem with that? What's wrong with athletics being used to promote something as good and true as the Christian gospel? Well, clearly there's nothing wrong with athletes or ministry representatives or any American practicing and expressing their religious faith. I mean, it's a right that all of us possess in this country, and it's a right that I've stood up for in many of my columns. But that's not the whole story, and I believe we should see this phenomenon for what it is. As I often say, this isn't some non-controversial, generic form of faith that's being practiced and promoted. I found that it's usually a conservative and exclusive form of evangelical Christianity with a strong emphasis on salvation through Jesus Christ and Jesus Christ alone. For an example of what I'm talking about, let's take a look at the doctrinal statement published by Baseball Chapel, which is the organization that provides chaplains for all the teams in Major League and Minor League Baseball. Sinful people may be reconciled to God only through the shed blood of Jesus Christ. We believe in the resurrection of the dead, for the unbeliever, resurrection to judgment and everlasting punishment separated from God. Okay, so this is their belief, and they are absolutely entitled to it. And this is a theology that is shared by many conservative Christians, so there's nothing surprising about that. My point here is that I think the public should be aware of the belief foundation that underlies the strategy of these organizations. And belief can and does lead to action. There are numerous stories that I've come across of overzealous evangelism to Jews and other non-Christians in professional baseball, of non-Christian players feeling pressured to pray, and uncomfortably so, in the name of Jesus, for example. This kind of thing flared up in Washington a few seasons ago after the Washington Post quoted a Nationals player describing a certain interaction that he'd had with the team's chaplain. Here's how it was reported in the Post. The part that I would emphasize is the quote from the player, Ryan Church. "Jewish people, they don't believe in Jesus. Does that mean they're doomed?" John, the chaplain, nodded, "Yeah, that's what it meant." I was like, man, if they only knew. Other religions don't know any better. It's up to us to spread the word. So, this is something maybe we want to talk about in the Q&A, but I'm going to move on now to the portion of this talk in my book that deals with politics. This is the focus of one chapter in the book, and it's part of some other chapters. The basic point is that when Christian sports figures step into the political fray, which really does happen with some regularity, they almost always veer to the right. Recent years have furnished many high-profile case studies of Christian athletes and ex-athletes endorsing conservative politicians and causes, and of becoming candidates themselves. My research included some investigative journalism to try to get at the connections between the leading sports ministries and conservative money and interests and people, and I found that the connections were quite consistent and strong. I have one quick story to tell in that regard that may resonate since we're in Indiana tonight. You probably remember the 2007 Super Bowl when we had black Christian men coaching both teams, the Bears and the Colts. Here's a clip of Indianapolis coach Tony Dungy doing the customary post-game interview after the Colts won the game, which made him the first black coach ever to win the Super Bowl.
This performance by your team today. I'm so proud of our guys. We took the hit early with Methodist, but we talked about it. We said there's going to be a storm. We said the Lord doesn't always bring you directly through. Sometimes you got to work for it. And our guys just hung up and played so hard. And I just can't tell you how proud I am of our group, our organization, and our city right now.
This is one of those moments, Tony, where there's also social significance in this victory.
And to have your hands on the Vince Lombardi Trophy, tell me what this means to you right now.
I tell you what, I'm proud to be representing African American coaches, to be the first African American to win this. It means an awful lot to our country. But again, more than anything, I said it before, Lovie Smith and I, not only the first two African Americans, but Christian coaches, showing that you can win, doing it the Lord's way. We're more proud of that.
As you just saw, Coach Dungy downplayed the race question and emphasized his and Lovie Smith's Christian faith. Now, that disappointed many progressives who felt Dungy had an opportunity, maybe even an obligation, to address the persistent racial inequities that we have in this country. In the view of critics, Tony Dungy compounded the misstep over the ensuing weeks by agreeing to appear at the Indiana Family Institute fundraising banquet and endorsing that organization's fight against gay rights in Indiana. In my research, I found many, many similar examples of high-profile Christian sports figures jumping into political matters and jumping in on the conservative side. And you find very few counterexamples of Christian athletes becoming active in progressive causes. Now, I think this is interesting and cause for concern, not just among the non-religious, but among Christians, in a time when so many evangelicals, especially the younger generation, are breaking away from the Christian right stance and finding political expressions of their faith that are broader and more nuanced and less ideological than those of the old guard. So, as I said before, I think secularists, and these are often the people pushing back against religion and sports, have done too little thoughtful examination of what's going on here and have failed to articulate any kind of thoughtful case or cause for concern. as I say in the introduction of my book, being annoyed and saying snarky things is not good enough. So what is that case? Well, here's my stab at it. Pro sports franchises, despite being private businesses, have a public role and a public mission, and with that, a public responsibility. There's this unifying role that we expect them to play in our communities. They create this space where people set aside their differences to cheer together for the home team. There's the fact that franchises have invited us to think of the teams as our team. We see this in the way the teams are marketed. We see it in the way franchises build new stadiums, financed in whole or in large part by the public. So these are some of the reasons why I believe franchises have a public responsibility, and why it's cause for concern that our leagues and teams are being used by sports world Christians in a manner that is not in the interests of the religiously and politically diverse communities that support these teams. So I think it's fair to at least question and examine the appropriateness of this use of pro sports. Now, I want to make it very clear that I'm not a religion hater. I'm not against Christianity in sports. My hope is not to get rid of it, but to see it evolve into something that is more inclusive and unifying and constructive. So let's spend the last minute or two before the Q&A talking about that. And that's what I consider the redemptive part of the story and hopefully of my book. In my journeys, I had some fascinating discussions with the men on the front edge of an evolution that is taking place, beginning to take place anyway, in sports ministry. Guys who candidly acknowledge certain failings on the part of sports world Christianity and who are committed to bringing constructive change. In particular, I'm talking about the interactions I had with Athletes in Action, which is known as a deeply conservative organization. They told me about their growing interest in creating a form of Christianity in sports that is less about exploiting the platform, as they put it, and more about serving athletes and serving society. I spent a day and a half at the headquarters of AIA in Xenia, Ohio, and it was a very eye-opening experience, and I found a lot of my own stereotypes challenged and even blown apart. I'm going to briefly read a passage from the book that deals with this trip that I had to AIA. I had an eye and mind-opening conversation with Mark Householder, coordinator of international ministry operations, and a man, by the way, who earlier this year was named the new president of AIA. Householder had returned from the Africa Cup soccer competition in Ghana. It was one of many trips to Africa taken by Householder, who exuded deep concern for the African continent and for racial reconciliation in his own country. Like most of the staffers I met, Householder was keenly aware of the larger religious, political, cultural milieu in which his ministry operates. He told me, the methods that were effective over the past 20 years are now not working. The culture has shifted. People are getting their information in different ways. People have different values. The church isn't doing a great job of representing the gospel when we're too tied up with criticizing lifestyle choices. Householder moved on to something else that worried him, the way Christian pro athletes represent the faith. It was hardly the case that he and his colleagues wanted players to be quiet about Jesus, but he was questioning the when and the how of evangelizing. Quote, "We live in a culture that requires greater discernment," Householder explained. Quote, "I would question the practice of athletes witnessing in post-game interviews. How effective is that in today's culture? There is definitely a shift in organizations like ours in thinking through what is the most effective way of reaching people with the gospel." At the next day's all-staff meeting, I witnessed a vivid reminder of an absolutely central focus of Athletes in Action, of something that was not up for renegotiation. Evangelism, 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 Ministry President William Pugh avowed as he held forth in front of a banquet hall full of staffers. Evangelism. Doug Pollock was thinking that way too, as might be expected of the man serving as AIA's evangelism director. But upon being introduced to Pollock, I learned within seconds that he was in the midst of reinventing how to go about fulfilling the Great Commission. Pollock said something impressive for its lack of defensiveness and for its clear truth. "We have not," he said, "brought salvation to the sports world." It was a startling admission from a man who was part of an organization that has been hard at work for more than 40 years to bring Jesus to athletes. Pollock went on to explain that the agents of Christianity in sports would champion the faith more fully if they went farther and deeper than just saving individual souls, and dedicated themselves to saving the soul of the sports colossus itself. He said, sports ministries like ours must bring the whole gospel to the world of sports if we are going to save it from what it has become. In my book, I get into some of the examples where sports exploits and abuses. Now, I love pro sports, and I think there are many wonderful things about it. But as these guys in ministry said, something has gone wrong in some ways with pro sports. And certainly there's probably an obsession with it that is out of proportion. And an obsession with winning that kind of invites all sorts of unethical behavior and other shortcuts. And I think it's fascinating that guys in ministry think that they need to shift and start looking at that aspect of their mission. So as I often tell people, I'm not against religion in sports. If anything, I'm for more religion in sports. If by more we mean religious practice in sports that is more inclusive of all faiths, that is more prophetic, and that is more committed to serving athletes and serving communities. So I don't believe that we need a separation of church and sport. My hope is for a better and more prophetic and unifying shape of faith in the game. So let me wrap it up with that and start the discussion. What do you have to say?
I now get my second job. I get to bring the microphone to people.
I wonder if this says more about sports, or does it really speak just more of a continuation of what I call the pseudo-Christians on the radical right, infiltrating various aspects of society. So is it really a sports issue, or is it a radical pseudo-Christian right issue?
I wouldn't use the radical pseudo-Christian language because I try to be very respectful in the things that I say and write. And a lot of these guys I found are really good guys and they're well-intentioned. They have a much different take on things politically and theologically than I do. But I think you're spot on and very astute in what you're saying. In my research and writing, I've talked about the way evangelicals use all aspects of popular culture to get their message out. Not just in big pro sports. You see skateboard ministries, you have Christian rock, you have Christian television, you have Christian media, Christian movies. And sports should be seen as part of that sort of engagement with the popular culture, all toward the end of getting the message out about Jesus. So I commend you on that insight. I think that's absolutely true. I would say that sports is one area that hasn't received the kind of examination that it probably deserves. So what else do we have?
I'm one of those nice evangelical right-wing Christians. I'm also a sports economist, married to a Baptist preacher. I don't know what the disclaimers I can give you. I'm the mother of athletes, and my daughter is the president of the local Fellowship of Christian Athletes. Okay, so that pretty much covers who I am. And I really appreciate the fact that you're bringing the idea of sports and religion to bear so that we can have this conversation. And I thought it was really interesting the clips that you gave, and I would have said that they were lovely, that they were delightful, that those were men of honor who had accomplished something and they wanted to take the highlight off of them and put it on the person that they, the Lord say they wanted to put it on that person who gave them the skill, the strength, the perseverance, whatever it is that they brought them through that. Because for every one episode that you showed, I can give you 1,000 clips of young men on the sports field acting terribly. Every time they make a tackle, yeah, man, great, right? Every time they win a game, whether it's significant or not, I'm a college fan. Okay, so the fact that we won the last game of the season, who cares, right? Next year. So, the fact that they're out there going, yay, me, I, is not the type of athlete, the type of person I want my children to emulate. Michael Jordan, when he won, what was the commercial that came out after Michael Jordan won? I'm going to Disney World. Okay, now did everybody criticize Disney for having Michael Jordan be their sponsor? No. If you went into a sales meeting for P&G, do you think that they would be saying, sell more ties, sell more ties? Well, that's their job, that's their purpose. And so I think that while it's great that you're bringing this to bear, you're only really showing one side. And the rest of us, well, not the rest, me, and my husband, who I know shares with you, don't know what the rest of you, might see this. But lots of people don't. And if the Buddhists and the Muslims and the Jews and the others want to express their religiosity, they should. There's nothing holding them back. And, when I see Coach K do the sign of the cross and pull out his rosary beads when he's nervous about a game of duty, I'm okay with that. And I don't know why so many people who don't believe are so offended and so put away. And when we have so many athletes who are into the stands at Detroit and beating up on our fans. I mean, come on, we have choices here, and my gosh, I'd much rather have a Coach Dungy or a Kurt Warner or one of those other people that you showed up at the microphone, reflecting away from themselves onto something bigger. So that's fine. No more Ray Warner.
No, I really appreciate your comments. I resonate with a lot of the things you're saying. I think you heard me say that there are many positive things about this movement, and that pro sports could really use that kind of moral force. I often tell people that I greatly admire Kurt Warner and some of these other Christian athletes, and I meant it when I said that they demonstrate outstanding personal morality. I think there's something positive too about during this age of me in sports, they deflect the attention, which I think is what you said. I'm really fascinated by the reasons people react negatively to certain forms of Christian expression. After the talk I gave last night in Massachusetts, a coach of one of the teams at Springfield College came up. And he's an evangelical Christian. And at first I thought he was going to kind of jump on me because we started talking about this hostility toward Christians. You heard Herb Lusk mention in that video clip this hostility against Christians. And that puzzles and fascinates me. I asked this guy at Springfield last night, why do you think there is so much hostility toward Christians? And he said, well, because of the Christians. And he cited some examples of Christian behavior. But I think his answer, I'm still working this out for myself, but I think that's only part of the answer. I think secularists and progressives have developed these stereotypes, and they are unfair often in the way that they criticize anything that is even remotely religious. And so I think people on that side of the equation need to open their minds a little bit more and give some space for Christians to practice their faith and communicate their message. Thank you very much for speaking so candidly. I appreciate your comments. We have somebody back there with his hand up. Oh, okay.
Just wondering if you see active recruitment and pressure to join the evangelical movement among the athletes, like in the locker room. Do you get pressure to join the Lord's Prayer?
You could say pressured, you could say encouraged, you could say invited. The language here has all sorts of different connotations. And I think one of the ministry guys, if he was here, he would say, it's an invitation. It's not pressure. But these are, difficult things. Sometimes the person who hears the invitation feels pressured. And sometimes it can be, it can start a whole negative conversation about, well, you're going to hell, or... So these are complicated things. But yes, there are stories where pro athletes say that they felt uncomfortable and they felt pressured and they didn't appreciate it, but they went along. Because let's face it, in sports, there's a real emphasis on team unity. And people need to follow the lead, whether it's the coach or the captain. Sometimes when the coach or the captain is overtly religious, it creates some discomfort for the guys on the team who aren't religious. Often they'll go along with it, though, because they don't want to, make trouble. If they're a marginal player, they don't want to get kicked off the team. There's this ex-pro football player named Anthony Pryor, who's a very outspoken critic of all of this. He told me that some of the marginal players go around in training camp with a Bible under their arm and make sure that everybody sees it and the coach sees it. so that people think he's a good guy. And then Pryor says that as soon as the season starts and they've made the team, you don't see the Bible. But on the other hand, it can be an invitation. And evangelicals will tell you that this is an invitation that could change somebody's life for the better. So many different things you could say about that.
Have you seen any challenges by people non-Christian, marginal Christian, or liberal Christians who are pressuring for tolerance? Have you seen any groups crop up?
Wait, who are pressured? I'm not quite sure I understand. Pressured for?
For tolerance, or less evangelical, more broad, allowing.
Yeah, like if there's been any sort of pushback by players or, well, I'm not sure I fully grasp the question, but it does bring to mind something that happened with the Washington Nationals back in 2005. Do you remember that clip I showed about how there was this problem with this apparent anti-Semitism in the Nationals locker room and in the teachings of the chaplain? Well, after that happened, the Jewish community in Washington sort of rallied. And this man named Rabbi Hertzfeld kind of stepped forward and started leading some protests against this evangelical operation around the Nationals and pressed Major League Baseball to do an inquiry. And something stunning happened. Bud Selig, the baseball commissioner, was quoted in the press saying that he was going to look into it. Why is it that Baseball Chapel is the one organization that has privileged access to all the locker rooms? And I was amazed as somebody who had been following this. I had never heard a commissioner say anything besides platitudes about religion and sports. Usually, these guys don't want to have that conversation. So Selig said he was going to look into it. But then, nothing happened, and he pretended like he had never said he was going to look into it. Several times I called Major League Baseball, and I called the PR office, and I said, I want some follow-up. The commissioner said he was going to look into this. What's the resolution? What's the determination? And it wasn't even no comment. It was, they didn't return the call. There was just nothing. And to my knowledge, correct me if you know otherwise, but to my knowledge, baseball has never said a word about it since then. I do know there was one outcome. Baseball Chapel itself removed that chaplain and replaced him.
Do you see any difference between these athletes crediting God for their great achievement and, say, like a cancer patient crediting God for healing them, remission of their cancer from an accident victim, saying, the angels were with me?
No, there is a similarity, and I think gratitude is a very it's a common and quite appropriate form of religious expression. And so if a pro athlete just is overwhelmed with gratitude and he says, thank God, I think that's entirely natural, and I don't see any problem with that whatsoever. Seriously. President Casey, were you going to ask something?
Yeah, I feel like Professor Dixon's list of qualifiers. I was an athlete in Notre Dame, so sports and religion being brought together is something that I'm raised on. But and actually her husband saved my life last year, so it's confession. I shouldn't do confession, should I? No, I want to push actually what I should go about is talking about next lawyer, so I'm going to play lawyer for a bit.
Sure.
One of your arguments is that we ought to be concerned because these pro teams and pros stadia have become quasi-public venues, and that therefore we should be worried that religiosity introduced into a public forum is dangerous because much as if the state can't sponsor religion, you're making an argument that any sports field can't be a venue for the promotion of any specific religion. I want to put your argument differently and say, well, if it is a public venue, then a certain type of First Amendment rights kick in, and that anyone should be entitled, actually, to proclaim that which there's free speech protections that follow, and we protect speech that's actually difficult. We don't protect speech that's easy. And so the fact that for some it's offensive, one could argue that it deserves more protection. If I took your argument back to its furthest.
Yeah, that's not where I take it, though. Unfortunately, in a 45-minute talk, you can't cover everything you do in a book. So I really appreciate the point and the question. So I would not ban these ministries whatsoever, and I would not ban religion in sports. I think these evangelical people and ministries have a right. As I said, though, in the close of my talk, I wish and I hope that pro-sports religious activity was more open and more inclusive of a range of faith perspectives. Why is it that the people who have the privileged access to the clubhouses and the players all come from this one perspective? Well, the answer to that is that they're the ones who went for it. And the others, the moderates and the liberals and the atheists, they didn't go for it. And so that's often the reason why evangelicals have this outsized influence and visibility, because they go for it. That's what they're about. And that's something that's pretty cool about them and admirable. So I wouldn't legislate this, but I would try to open the door for a broader expression of religion. And in one of my chapters, I talk about faith days in professional baseball, where in major leagues now, in many minor league cities, you have Faith Day. The guy who organizes these says, well, truthfully, they should be called Evangelical Christianity Day. And at the end of the game, they have sort of a revival, and they have a speaker and a big Christian event. So I talked to one ticket manager with the Cincinnati Reds who's Jewish, and I asked him what he felt about Evangelical Faith Day. And he said, actually, I admire them, and I wish the Jewish community would do something similar. And the guy who runs these said, hey, I'm not against the Muslims having their day, or the interfaith community, or the Catholics. Nobody's stopping them. The teams just want to sell tickets. And so part of the solution, I think, is for other people to go for it. If they want to have their interests represented in this sector of our society, they need to do something about it and insert themselves into the conversation.
You made an earlier comment about the evangelical Christians made up 40% of the...
With some teams, I said something approaching 40% with some of the teams.
Okay, how do you make a gauge between whether somebody's Christian or whether they're evangelical? I mean, I kind of throw all Christians in the same bunch. I mean, they all want to, introduce people to Christ as part of what they're called to do. So how do you make a distinction between what a Christian becomes evangelical versus I guess you're going to say there's non-evangelical Christians, but I don't know any of those. But how did you make that distinction?
Well, first of all, I would say that you have to be careful, and I try not to say that you can have a precise count. There have been no surveys, and even if there was, you would have to treat it with some skepticism, because you don't know if their answers are going to be truthful. You don't know what's in somebody's heart. And so when it comes to these kind of measures, you have to be really careful and kind of humble about how much you know. You have to give a range and say things like generally and depending on which team.
Sure.
So how do you know who's evangelical and who's not?
Well,
it depends on their rhetoric and their behavior and the kind of doctrine that they express.
Okay, so what percentage of pro athletes are Christian? I mean, just like whether they're evangelical or not. We're talking about as a general population, that particular subset of our country, isn't it a pretty large percentage?
Oh, it is.
People are Christians, so if they behave like Christians, that would seem like it kind of makes sense, because that's what they're made up. That's what the body's made up of. So if you go to, I don't know, so that's where I kind of, they're just fitting in, I guess is what I'm trying to point out.
Right, I see what you're saying. So let's talk a little bit. What's your faith tradition?
I'm Christian.
Do you consider yourself an evangelical?
I think that's part of the definition of a Christian who wants to call their people to find Jesus, to understand what Jesus is about. That's part of the Christian faith. That's how we get salvation. So,
well, this is one area where I do make a distinction, and I don't mean to diss your beliefs whatsoever. But in my research, I see that there is a distinction. Evangelicals tend to have a more exclusive form of belief, and they would tell you that their form of belief is the right one, the one right belief. And they would say, maybe not in a mean way, or maybe not explicitly, but they would say implicitly or explicitly that other religions are to varying degrees wrong. And I find that the other Christians I engage with, like moderates and liberals, they tend to have a different message about those other religions, and they're not going to say that other religions are wrong. They're not going to say that a Jew is going to hell or that Muslims are not in good standing with God. They're not going to judge those other religions. So You tell me, do you think that's a fair distinction?
I'm not sure, even within the Christian faith, there are so many different branches and versions of Christianity. How do you have to be fully submersed to be baptized? Do you put a little water on your head? What is it? Are you confirmed? Do you go through confirmation? All of these different things, there's no agreement on. So it's just kind of like, we're drawing these lines in the sand. My whole idea is, I go to a Presbyterian church. That doesn't mean I'm a Christian. I just root myself in there. You get on the Jesus bus. That's what it is for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of think it's strange that I don't know how. You're a scholar, and you're just dissecting this, and you're trying to put everything into compartments so it will make sense so you can talk about it. But it's difficult for me to do that. And my whole point by asking that question was trying to point out that the vast majority of these people who watch these sports or engage in them are probably of the Christian faith. So if they act like Christians, that's where I start to think, well, it's kind of what they do. I mean, if it was a sport that a whole lot of Buddhist people play, then they would have a Buddhist prayer at the beginning of it, and they would do, whatever it is. I think that people kind of behave like.
But within the Christian world, there are so many different ideas about the theology. After this thing happened with the Nationals, one of the people who spoke up against that form of religious practice was a Presbyterian minister. And he said that Christianity, or most Christians anyway, have reconciled themselves to the fact that we don't know what's going to happen with Jews, and we're not ready to say as Christians that Jews are out of favor with God. I thought it was kind of outstanding that a Christian minister was one of the people who protested what was happening with Christianity in the Nationals clubhouse. See, one thing about my career as a writer, there's kind of a central puzzle that I continually try to solve. Earlier I mentioned this idea of one truth Christianity. And I'm also someone who greatly values pluralism and religious diversity. So it's a puzzle. How do you accommodate the religious freedom of one truth Christianity in an arena where you have diverse pluralistic environment? Because if you give everybody religious freedom and everybody is free to speak, well, one group is going to have a message that has something to say about the other groups possibly being wrong. So how do you give evangelicals full religious freedom while respecting the validity and the rights of everybody else? I'm saying that's a puzzle and something I'm continually trying to figure out. If somebody has something wise to say about that, I'd love to hear it.
Probably I could make a comment here and a question. Because as I listened to your presentation, where you just ended up, I wonder if we not sort of ask ourselves, how do we think of this sports space? If we probably projected back in history, what took place in those Roman arenas where you had Christians in front of thrown to riots and things like that? Were they contesting a construction of the space that excluded them? Were they fighting in their time for inclusion? How do we take that and bring it forward into the present? Take, for example, Chariots of Fire.
Take, for example, Chariots of Fire.
Chariots of Fire, which is a very classic sports movie. What sort of questions on inclusion are being asked in Chariots of Fire, where the Jewish guy who goes to Cambridge feels he doesn't belong, but he has to use sports in order to carve out a space for himself within a very Christian-dominated Cambridge University system. So I'm taking a question of Christianity and plurality and bringing it forward. So that's a commentary part of my question. The question I want to ask you then, I don't know if you saw the last Confederations Cup in South Africa, football cup in South Africa, which is a kind of warm-up to the World Cup.
Yeah, I did see some of that.
The captain of the Brazilian team had a T-shirt on the front marked "I love Jesus." And I think there were a couple of others who were wearing similar did their best not to focus on those teachers. Do you have any idea whether that was a sort of penetration of the Christian right or evangelical phenomena into Brazil being thrown back into South Africa?
No, I cannot claim that my research could give me an informed opinion about that. I haven't examined that. But there is something you said that interests me a lot. A couple times I talked about the pushback. Well, the media are a real source of that. I can't tell you how many snarky columns I've read by sports writers and columnists talking about, God doesn't care who wins a football game. I wish these athletes would keep their religion to themselves. You see a lot of that. And I have heard that sometimes the media will try to keep the religion part out of it. I've read interviews with sports writers who say that, sometimes they're asked, why'd you take out what the guy said about his faith in Jesus? And they'll say, well, it wasn't pertinent to the story, so I took it out. With the live interview at the end of a game, that's when it's completely unfiltered and unedited. And that's often a chance for the religious athlete to get his point across without having it end up on the cutting room floor. So I'm sorry I don't have a more intelligent thing to say about your question, but one thing you said really did provoke one thing that interests me a lot. So thanks for bringing that up.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
a writer for the DePauw, which is my school newspaper.
Yeah, you have a good paper.
Yes, I'm a writer, just a writer right now. Anyway, I was wondering, as a writer, how do you take the issue of stepping around, like, offending anyone in the situation of writing about evangelical Christians?
How did I step around the issue of offending anyone?
I'm sure you offended some people.
Well, this is something that will be familiar to the guests we had at dinner, but this whole thing stresses me out a lot because I'm a conflict-averse person. I'm not into arguments. I was invited once to go on the O'Reilly show, and I said no. And this book is controversial, and the articles I write are controversial. I know there are people in the audience tonight who don't like what I have to say and think I've been unfair. I mean, I'm always challenging myself to look at what I've said, and is it fair? Is it informed? I'm going to have my opinion, and I have my own perspectives, and I have a right to that too. But some of the stuff that I write really does offend people, so you may wonder, why would somebody who's conflict averse write about this stuff? Well, it's kind of crazy.
Tom, thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks, Ken.
One thing that really irks me, I guess, and I think is troubling on a deeper level, is I want to see the guys wear the I Love Jesus t-shirts when we lose. I mean, I think implicit in some of this messaging is that Christians are the winners. Tony Dungy beats Lovie Smith. Tony Dungy was a better Christian that year. Or Lovie Smith missed a couple of services. I mean, somehow we all lose in life. We all have bad days. We all suffer losses. And I think that's when we really need our faith the most. And just to hold your hand up when you're winning and to, not express that message when you're down and out. And maybe they do wind up in the cutting room floor. But I think it's really important to stress that life is a winning and losing game.
Well, we talked about this a little bit at dinner. And this is one part of the equation that really fascinates me. And the chapter in the book that I'm sort of my favorite chapter is called Winning for Jesus, but Finding Him in the Lost Column. The tricky relationship between evangelism and sports success. And in that chapter, I tell the story of Athletes in Action, which from its very founding has always emphasized athletic excellence as the platform for its evangelism. There's even a famous quote from an AIA guy back in the 60s when he said, God doesn't care who wins, but Americans do. I.e., if we're going to get the attention of Americans and get our message across, we got to be good and we got to win. And they had a basketball team that was famous, toured the country, played top college teams, and it could beat them. And then they would have a religious event at halftime and after the game where they would share their faith with people. And in that same chapter, I tell the story of the Detroit Lions in 2007. You're smiling because you know what I'm talking about. In 2007, the Detroit Lions started out as a very hot team. They'd been a bad team forever, but they won 6 out of their first 8 games. And there were all these stories coming out, both in secular and Christian media, about the tremendous Christian fervor that was developing in that locker room. For one thing, they had John Kitna as quarterback, and he's probably the most outspoken evangelical athlete we have. And there was a story about him coming back from a concussion in the second game of the season, and he claimed it had been a miracle. So the Lions won. They were 6-2 at the halfway point, and a lot of media picked up on the story and said stuff about the faith-fueled Lions. There were stories of mass Christian conversions and all this Christian unity around the team. They'd have this huddle at the end of practice where they'd go, 1, 2, 3, Jesus. And so this was held up as an example of the wonder-working powers of faith and sort of a hook for telling people that, Christianity is great and this is what it can do for you. Well, then something very inconvenient happened. They went 1-7 in the second half of the season, and the next year they went 0-16. And I don't say that to be cynical, because when I looked into it, I discovered there was a very redemptive story there. That's why the subtitle is, Finding Jesus in the Lost Column. But none of the media picked up on this, not even the Christian media, to my knowledge. They didn't talk about the redemptive power of faith in the midst of losing. They didn't talk about John Kitna giving this amazing sermon at the end of the year, where he talked about how his faith changed and grew and deepened. And so I'm excited about that chapter because I get to tell that story. And it's probably going to surprise people who want to grab my book and say, yeah, Christians are bad and all that, because there's a redemptive story there, and I stick up for John Kitna. And so it's a fascinating thing, the issue of winning and of Christianity. What's the relationship? Thanks for the question. Got me going.
I have one thing to say about Tony Dungy. If you're going to show that part about winning, and he won the game over Ronnie Smith, people forget that the year before that, he didn't win and lost his son, and his Christian faith was as strong or it was stronger at that point. So I think the media has taken this and said, he only speaks, he's a winner, so God blesses him more. He had a lot of problems and has had a lot of problems, and he continues to be a platform, I think, as a coach, whether he's winning or not.
Oh, he's a great role model. I think he is one of the most admired men in America, and to me, he's one of the most admirable men we have in public life in this country. In particular, I appreciate the work he does with prisoners, because they're probably the least vulnerable population. And if you want to find one of the truest expressions of Christianity, I think it's serving prisoners, the least of these. And so I'm a big fan of his, even though he disappointed me when he kind of played the God card when he came out against gay rights. The people in ministry often talk about Tony Dungy as the best role model, and they say he's the same win or lose. That's what's great about him. Thanks for bringing that up.
I think you have made some really good points, and I think beyond that, you also brought to the forefront that one of the deepest things here is that we're dealing with beliefs. To give an analogy that's light, but hopefully appropriate, people in Indiana love basketball, so there's your sports analogy. But people either love IU basketball, or they love Purdue basketball. When we're talking about religion, people either love Jesus or Muhammad or Buddha. So how do you have that conversation? And if you were the commissioner of baseball, how would you set up the religious environment within baseball that people could have these beliefs and yet still be fair?
Mm-hmm. And should you have one organization that has this particular doctrinal base being the one organization that has access to all the teams in professional baseball? I mean, that goes all the way down through the minor leagues. All the chaplains come from baseball chapel. Well, I wish I knew what Bud Selig had actually done and what he had found and what he concluded. And interestingly enough, he's Jewish, as is the NBA commissioner. So maybe if I were to write a sequel, I would give this a little more critical study. And I don't spend a lot of time in the book saying, how do you fix this? I just try to get that conversation started. But it's kind of what I said before. What can you do to set up measures so that there's an opportunity for other faith perspectives to deal with players? I know a young Jewish man who wants to be a sports chaplain. Well, he doesn't have a chance. What changes can we create such that you can have a Jewish man serving in sports ministry and providing religious counsel, not just to Jewish players, but to all of the athletes? And so that's not a full answer, but maybe it's a way to start thinking about what changes we might create so that there's more of a full range of faith perspectives in this sector of our society. And that, frankly, that religious players who aren't Christian and also members of the community who aren't Christian can somehow feel that this team is open to their interests and their perspectives as well. Not instead of, but in addition to.
Looking at it just a little bit further on, looking at upper management and the owners, and the fact that the players, through the owners and through the leagues, support United Way. There's a lot of activities going on with the disaster and the loans and those things. A lot of that is public promotional for the teams and for the sport, okay? But it is also in Christian terms, outreach, sharing, and fulfillment. And there are times, even here, like with the basketball team at IUPUI, the coach playing for shoes for kids, soles, and things like that. But is it coming from the top down, or are you just saying it's coming in from the chaplains, more or less up?
You mean the religious practice?
Right. Is it something that's permeated the whole level of the sport and not just the player?
Well, it depends on the team. There was a big story in USA Today 2 years ago about the Colorado Rockies. This caused kind of a sensation. That team was portrayed as a team that was Christian from management, from the owner through to the general manager, to the manager, and lots of the players. And I think that even in the interview, some of the guys on the team said they were reluctant, the management said they were reluctant to admit this because they knew there could be some controversy about it. So that was an example of a team where the religious perspective permeated the whole thing. But I think in most cases it happens more at the level of the players. And I know in some cases coaches think it's kind of a headache. They think that the players have a right to have some religious resources, and they think that it does some good, but they also worry about the conflicts. I tell the story in my book about what happened with the Baltimore Ravens a few years ago. The players on the team started arguing about who was going to be their chaplain. Some of them wanted the guy from Athletes in Action, and then some other guys wanted this guy from an even more conservative group called Champions for Christ. And then the coach had to get called in and mediate the thing, and he said, this is getting to be a headache. Religion isn't supposed to be this kind of thing that causes conflict. So I think you're going to find that the dynamics vary a lot from team to team. I think with the Colts, I know at least from some of his statements that the owner seems to be an outspoken Christian. You guys probably know more about that than I do. I haven't studied him closely, but he did definitely speak up about faith when they won the Super Bowl. Is he someone who seems to be known as a outspoken, practicing Christian?
That he plants ideas. Whether you agree with him or not, he gives you food for thought. You'll be finding yourself thinking about this and processing it for many days to come. If you're not aware of his columns, he writes with USA Today. You can also go to Krattenmaker.com and find a detailed listing of most of his columns from the last 4 years. It's very good reading. His book is available tonight, and for a donation to which sports chaplaincy you'd be willing to sign?
Athletes in Action.
Okay. Maybe that will balance out something. Good. Hasn't this been an engaging Mendenhall? Let's give Tom a hand. Thank you. We will see you next year for Mendenhall 2010. Thank you very much. And if those who are students would like to have breakfast in the morning with Tom, we'll be meeting at 2 West at 8 o'clock. Let me know if you're coming.